Hello and welcome to the Guest Education Global Leadership Summit. Thank you for joining us. We're pleased to introduce Dr. Leslie Hunter, a strategic consultant, government advisor, and leadership coach who works with schools in the UK, Europe, and the Middle East, developing authentic leader behaviors specifically linked to self-evaluation school improvement. We hope that you enjoyed the session, and over to you, Dr. Leslie.
Thank you. There are many challenges in education at the moment, and with the context in which we are working changing significantly as it has over the last 12 to 18 months, we have to ask whether behaving in the same way as we always have done before and trying to lead the same way as we have in the past, is that behaviour still fit for purpose? There's immense pressure on teachers and school leaders at all levels. We've got to maintain trust, stabilise communication, support reliable, accessible, remote blended learning solutions, and we've got to think about the students that are falling behind, all with the aim of minimising the educational impact of the global pandemic on the performance of the next generation. So the key challenges are going to require many leaders to redefine their established behaviour, and for schools to handle the relentless pressure to tackle growing performance gaps, and at the same time continuing to provide stability, security, and support for all stakeholders as we continue to work together and navigate through this period of turbulence, uncertainty, and change. So against this backdrop, thinking about self-evaluation is probably not at the top of your priority list at the moment. But from my experience, and I've worked with over 4,000 schools, I've found it's those schools that keep self-evaluation first and foremost in their sights that are best placed to respond. They can adapt and flex to circumstances as and when they arise. So because these schools have embedded and integrated self-evaluation into daily routines and activities, they actually build a much stronger platform to scaffold their ability to change. So I am advocating that now is precisely the right time while we're all under pressure. And now is precisely the right time when in schools, we're undoubtedly going to be facing further scrutiny in the future. So now, precisely the right time to revisit the place and the purpose of self-evaluation in your school, but to start considering the behaviours of the leaders that are needed to support it. Now, for many schools, self-evaluation is a busy process. It often distracts and gets in the way of what teachers think they should be doing. We really can't afford to let this continue. And obviously, leaders need to make a positive contribution to self-evaluation and school improvement. But while we're juggling all of these other issues and all the other competing demands on our time, I believe we need to stop and look again. Look at the behaviours and make sure we're doing the right things at the right time for the right reasons. So the School Leader Inventory is a behavioural framework that I'm going to share with you today. And it was originally developed through research into authentic leadership and the behaviours needed to be effective as a leader in the 21st century. It's been refined specifically to look at school leaders and the contribution that leaders make to authentic self-evaluation with a focus on driving school improvement. It's been used now with over 600 school leaders in a number of countries. So let me introduce you to the SLI, a framework that you can download freely and take away, and you can start using it immediately in your school today. Use it to start conversations around leadership behaviour. Use it to clarify and share a vocabulary about leader behaviour. Start to look for balance across your school and look for any themes or patterns that arise in perhaps your middle and senior leadership teams. And we're going to start right now by exploring the framework, unpicking these 6 key dimensions, each of which have 3 elements of behaviour associated with them. So we've got a framework here that you can start using as a frame of reference for your own school leaders. And the first question is, how do people learn to be a leader? So let's start with identity. I see it happen so often, and effective classroom teachers given the opportunity to take leadership responsibility. They go on some training, they understand the things they now need to do, but how do they actually learn to behave as a leader? How do they learn to be a leader? So it's very, very rare that individuals consciously sit down and establish their own behavioural blueprint. This is how I am going to lead. And we usually acquire that by watching and modelling others. Think of the most inspiring or motivating person you know, or the best leader you've ever worked with. And that copying and modelling is absolutely fine, but to a point. Because at that stage, you're not really thinking about your own behaviour. You're thinking about how someone else would behave. So this first dimension of identity, it focuses on the fact that your positional behaviour has to come from you. It's your own core values. And the way I put it forward is to say, think like you're taking a mental selfie where your values form a canvas and you're going to create your behavioural blueprint. So stop, step back, ask yourself, what are my core values as a leader? Where are the red lines, the non-negotiables? What are the things that I won't compromise? Professionalism, honesty, respect, tolerance. What does it look like in terms of behaviour? And can you sit and define that good behaviour for each value? And similarly define bad or unacceptable behaviour for each value? Because it's only when you get to that deep forensic level that you really start understanding what it means to you to be a leader, and you start getting into your own identity. But once you have this canvas, this blueprint, you then need to turn to your internal resource and ask, where am I going to find the power to be able to behave in this way? And importantly, do I actually believe that I can? So identity, it brings into focus your confidence, your credibility as a leader, aligned with your ability to motivate and inspire yourself and match up to your internal blueprint. It's not about wearing a mask, stepping into someone else's shoes. It's the core essence of understanding who you are. And let's put this in the context of self-evaluation in your school, because the identity of different leaders is critical. It's about ownership of the process and the contribution of the behaviour that's going to support that process. So you can see that identity is all about self. It's your mindset, your capacity to internalize what it means to be a leader. But leaders don't lead in a vacuum. So if we link this to the second dimension, which is all about your role as a leader. Now, typically when I talk to people about their role, they give me this huge long list, tasks, activities they need to carry out. But that's basically your job description or your specification. And although that may be a formal contractual requirement, your role is so much richer than that. So let's think in a bit more detail and depth. Because your role is rooted in your purpose. Why are you there as a leader? If your identity is who you are, your role is why you are a leader. What is it that you're responsible for? Again, not what you have to do, but what are the outcomes you're trying to achieve? And the greater your seniority as a leader in a school, the more likely it is that you're responsible for leading others to do the actual things that will generate those outcomes. So a leader's role is nothing to do with a to-do list or a schedule. It starts with this bedrock of responsibilities. How well do you understand them, and how well can you articulate them? And with responsibilities come expectations. What is it that's expected of you by others? And what do you expect of them? Flip it. I don't just mean the outcomes, but how are you going to achieve that? And how are you expecting other people to behave? So if you take the selfie that you created in identity and wrap it in a box, you can think of the box as your role dimension because it has some structure. So if you're responsible for something and you have clear, well-defined expectations around those responsibilities, the structure gives you some boundaries, where the responsibility begins and where it ends. And they also need to be clear. So let's talk about boundaries. Because quite often these are ambiguous and they're left for individuals to interpret for themselves. If we put this back in the context of self-evaluation, that busy, complex process in your school, the need for clarity around boundaries becomes critical. Think about a time when you had multiple people involved. Lesson observations, learning walks, student voice, work scrutiny, and so on. And you ended up with loads of outputs and outcomes. But it didn't really tell you anything that you didn't already know. So a lot of time and energy, investment and emotion in those activities. But for what purpose? And this is where schools find that self-evaluation becomes a burden and people simply begin to think they're just going through the motions time and again for the sake of it. But the opposite can be just as true, because if the boundaries are not defined clearly enough, you end up with people assuming, that's not part of my responsibility, so I'll let someone else do it. And that's when you get gaps. So a lack of clarity around boundaries. It can lead to overlap, to overwhelm, to overload, or it can create gaps. And that's when you're in danger of missing something important. So if we take those two dimensions from the framework, identity and role, and think that together they create the scaffold for a leader in terms of how they should behave and how they should make their contribution to self-evaluation in the school. And we find that when schools adopt and use the SLI, they have access to an online diagnostic that supports the individual leaders with personal profiles and actions. It benchmarks their behaviour against other school leaders. It develops an action plan for them, all focused through the lens of their contribution to self-evaluation and school improvement. But you can also create team dashboards, and then it links to over 100 tools and techniques that help to support and facilitate behaviour and learning for leaders. So schools that have used this framework, there are some stark messages emerging. For example, 42% of school leaders almost always believe in themselves as a leader. That's great, but what about the rest of them? And nearly 10% rarely or never do. This links very strongly to the personal power and belief elements of identity. And it's particularly worrying, especially when we think about the need for school leaders to be really confident in driving performance following the difficult circumstances recently. Similarly, only 29% of school leaders are secure in their own self-worth as a leader. Again, this comes back to personal power and belief. So there's clearly some work to do around supporting key leaders in schools, all around establishing behaviour associated with identity and role. And the question I've got for you now is, how would you and your school leaders measure up against this? Now, the third dimension is referred to as attitude, and it's all about demonstrating congruence in your behaviour. So this is about people around you experiencing consistency and understanding the link between your thinking and your action. And a key feature of authenticity is this importance in developing trust. And it's particularly interesting that 87% of school leaders believe they develop trust in their followers. So let's unpick attitude a little more, because attitude is aligning how you think with what you say and then what you ultimately do. It's converting that thought process into action. Critical thinking, problem solving, decision making, making time and space for innovation, allowing opportunities to arise, embracing change. How do all of these cognitive processes translate through the way you communicate with people, and then how well aligned are the actions that you actually take? So if identity is who, role is why, we can think of attitude as being the what you actually do to ensure you align the previous two. In other words, as a leader, do you walk the talk? And one thing this global pandemic has really shown is that things can change in an instant. And that brings the importance of the fourth dimension, which is agility. Now, leaders are often judged not just on the speed of their reaction to change, but on their ability to take people with them and to maintain as much security and stability as possible through the process. And in project management, agility has a very, very clear definition around process, the way people work, and the way they work to achieve outcomes. But in this framework, we're looking at behaviour, and specifically how agile a leader is in their ability to firstly recognise and be aware of their own behaviour, but also that of others around them. Then being able to adapt, to regulate, and critically to be able to choose the way they want to behave and the best behaviour for the situation at any given point in time. So this means that in the SLI, agility is rooted in being flexible, having a broad repertoire to draw on. But it's also about being able to recognise what those behaviours are, how they've served you in the past. And that means that a key element of agility is how we use our intuition. Intuition is rooted in experience. So that's why as you gain more experience as a leader, it becomes even more important to be able to tap into your intuition and learn to strike that balance. Keep a balance between logical and intuitive decision making. And you might say, hang on, Leslie, wait a minute. Self-evaluation is a serious process. It should be based on evidence, not gut feeling. And you're absolutely right. So one of the key things is understanding the difference between your gut feeling and instinct and your intuition. Because intuition is all about recognizing patterns, themes, and trends. And you'll see there that resilience is another element of agility. And by resilience, I mean your ability not just to bounce back, to have grit, or to push through a difficult situation, but it's the capacity to stop, to step back, look at things from a different angle, get a different perspective, and giving yourself permission to create headspace and time. Allow your subconscious to draw on past experience and learning. Then come back to the situation, balance it, and critically choose how you're going to feel about it and how you're going to behave. So agility is not necessarily your speed or your pace of reaction. It focuses much more on the breadth and the balance in your behaviour and your ability to learn from experience. And schools are learning organisations. So it's particularly worrying when we look at this statistic, that 20% of school leaders confirmed through completing the SLI that they were afraid of experiencing failure. But only 29% regularly actually made that time and gave themselves that headspace to reflect and learn from their mistakes. This is critical, particularly in light of the need to support well-being and personal mental health following this global pandemic. And that's a key feature of the SLI, maintaining that balance between performance and well-being. So if we turn our attention now to the last two dimensions, these focus on how we engage and interact with others. And remember, all of this is through the lens of school leaders and how they contribute to self-evaluation and ultimately school improvement. And we all like to think that we can manage our own emotional state and maintain the balance. But again, here's another worrying statistic. As leaders, we all would like to think that we treat others fairly. Remember the saying, treat others as you would want to be treated yourself? The fairness dimension, the fifth dimension in the framework, balances the need to demonstrate integrity through your work by being open, honest, transparent, and professional, and treating people with respect. But a challenge for many leaders, particularly in the early days of transitioning into a leadership role, is to balance fairness, empathy with colleagues, at the same time as holding them to account for any outcomes they're expected to achieve. Now, an empathetic leader will typically develop a bond of loyalty and trust with individuals and teams. And if you remember back to the previous slide that showed 87% of leaders believe that they develop trust in their teams. Issues arise if or when difficult conversations need to be had. And these are the times at which leaders are much more likely to struggle to maintain boundaries of these relationships between leaders and followers, and especially when it comes to accountability. Having those difficult conversations is one of the key things that I'm constantly being asked to talk to school leaders about. And accountability is a critical element of the SLI framework. And that's because it's a behaviour that has a particular relevance to school self-evaluation. But it should be a two-way relationship between leaders and followers. And again, looking at some of our data, 81% of school leaders believe they do hold their colleagues to account. But let's start thinking now. Only 23% indicate that they regularly measure their own performance. And that's in relation to the expectations of their role. So how well are school leaders holding themselves to account? And this brings in the self aspect of self-evaluation. So hopefully you're now starting to see how the behaviours across all the dimensions interact and engage and support each other. Because the school leader inventory, the SLI, is an integrated model. It takes a holistic view of a leader's behaviour in the situation at that point in time. The final dimension of conflict, this continues the focus of a leader's engagement with others. But it's got a very specific emphasis on achieving an agreed, specified outcome. And it combines the ability to influence with a recognition of when and how to compromise. But the key element in conflict is to help leaders to build anticipatory behaviour, because these add forward thinking and future scenario planning perspectives to their work. So let's bring this all together again. Look at the full framework. 18 behavioural elements organised into 6 dimensions. And we've briefly touched on each dimension, but this framework is expanded by detailed descriptors for each of those constituent elements. And this helps to support a leader in developing good behaviour in each of these areas. The full SLI framework, it's available to download from the website. It's freely available. There you have it, a research-based behavioural framework designed specifically with school leaders to support school leaders. It's tried, it's tested, it works. In fact, a recently published doctoral study by one of my previous colleagues focused on how the SLI was a pivotal ingredient in helping schools move from good to outstanding when judged in external inspection ratings. So how can you use it now to redefine leader behaviour in your school? Well, today, now, download the full framework from the website. Introduce it into your school. Focus on the language. Use it to create a shared vocabulary, so you're all talking about the same things when you have your leadership discussions. And evidence has shown that adopting the SLI framework in this way can help schools, help create a shared vocabulary, help create an understanding of how leaders could and should behave, help to accelerate development, have that professional dialogue with emerging and established leaders, embed a culture of self-reflection, raise leaders' awareness of their behaviour and the impact it has on others. Critically help your leaders to understand that their behaviour can change depending on the situation. And this is really a key learning point, where leaders realise they can take control. There are techniques that can help them learn to take control of their own behaviour and their emotions, how they want to feel. Moving from individuals to teams, you can open up dialogue, develop trust and support strong, effective and high-performing teams, and make sure that you focus the attention in the key areas to improve performance. And a key feature I did mention was it helps to maintain a balance between self and behaviour with others. So a balance between personal well-being and a drive for performance, something we surely all need to pay attention to in the challenging days and months ahead. Thank you.
Brilliant. That was very informative. Thank you so much, Dr. Leslie. If anyone from the audience has any questions pertaining to the session, you can connect with Dr. Leslie through the networking system on the virtual event platform. We'd also love to hear from you, so feel free to share any thoughts or comments by sending us an email to marketing@guesteducation.com. We'll be on social media as well during the summit, so if you want to chat to us there, follow us on Twitter @guesteducation and use the hashtags #guestglobal and #guesteducation. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you, take care, and bye-bye for now.